Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I booked the cabin on a whim. A last-minute escape from a routine life that had become as gray as the weather outside my apartment window. The listing was perfect. A rustic retreat tucked into the quiet woods, promising solitude, a roaring fireplace, and crisp mountain air. Olivia, the host, had sent a cheerful message before my arrival, assuring me the cabin was ready and wishing me a peaceful stay. The moment I pulled up the gravel driveway, a sense of calm washed over me. The cabin was postcard perfect. Weathered wood, a sloped roof, and a small porch with a rocking chair swaying gently in the breeze. Yet, as I stepped out of the car, I noticed something odd. A faint scent of lavender hung in the air, carried on the breeze. It wasn't unpleasant, but it felt out of place, almost too deliberate, as if someone had sprayed it moments before I arrived. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the cleaning crew, and stepped inside. The interior was just as charming as the pictures. Cozy furniture, a stone fireplace with a stack of wood neatly piled nearby, and large windows that framed the towering pines outside. It was perfect, almost too perfect. That evening, I lit a fire, poured myself a glass of wine, and settled into the worn leather armchair with a book. The quiet was everything I had hoped for. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. As the night deepened, I began to relax, the stress of the city slipping away. Then I heard it. A faint creak above me, like the sound of a footstep on an old wooden floor. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, straining to hear more. Nothing. It must have been the house settling, I told myself. Old cabins make noises. It's part of their charm. But a few minutes later, it came again. This time, it was unmistakable. The deliberate sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, moving across the floor above me. My stomach twisted. The cabin was supposed to be empty. No one else had access. Or did they? I stood up, my hands trembling as I grabbed my phone. There was no signal. Of course not. I had known the cabin was remote, but the lack of service now felt suffocating. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the sound of those footsteps was impossible to ignore. Clutching a flashlight, I crept up the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out in both directions, dimly lit by a single bulb. The air felt colder here, and that lavender scent was stronger now, almost cloying. My eyes were drawn to the guest bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness peeked through the gap. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. No response. Summoning every ounce of courage, I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the bed was freshly made, the covers smoothed out with precision. And on the pillow, there was a distinct indentation, as though someone had just been lying there. A chill ran down my spine. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding. As I turned to head back downstairs, I felt it, a presence. It wasn't something I could see, but I could feel it, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on me. The scent of lavender was overwhelming now, making my head spin. I hurried down the stairs and grabbed my phone. My fingers fumbled as I typed out a message to Olivia. Is there any chance someone else has access to the cabin? I think I heard footsteps upstairs. Her reply came almost immediately. Are you sure? The last guest checked out 2 weeks ago, and no one has booked it since. My blood ran cold. 2 weeks? But the bed upstairs it had been used. I looked around the living room, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. Faint footprints on the wooden floor, leading from the staircase to the front door. Bare footprints, small and delicate, as if made by a woman. The smell of lavender grew stronger again, wrapping around me like a shroud. And then I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of someone standing behind me. My breath hitched as I turned slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. At the top of the stairs, she stood, a woman in a long, tattered dress, her hair hanging in damp, stringy strands around her pale face. Her eyes, they were empty, hollow, and unblinking. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but her gaze pinned me in place. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Then she took a step forward, and another. I don't remember how I found the strength to run. All I know is that I bolted out of the house, leaving the door wide open behind me. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. As I sped down the dark, winding road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood silent and still, but I swear I saw her silhouette in the upstairs window, watching me leave. The next morning, I called Olivia and told her everything. At first, she seemed dismissive, but when I mentioned the lavender scent, she went quiet. Finally, she admitted that other guests had reported strange occurrences. Footsteps, doors opening on their own, and always that overwhelming smell of lavender. She had dismissed them as pranks or overactive imaginations. I've never gone back to that cabin. Sometimes, late at night, I'll catch a whiff of lavender and feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'll never know who or what I shared that cabin with. And honestly, I don't want to. Story 2. I'm not usually the type to get spooked easily. I've traveled alone for years, stayed in all kinds of places, and faced my fair share of oddities. But this time, something was different. This time, I stayed in the kind of place you don't forget, no matter how hard you try. It started innocently enough. I had a business trip in the city and needed a cheap place to stay. The Airbnb listing caught my eye immediately. Cozy, modern apartment in the heart of downtown, the description read. The photos showed a clean, minimalist space with lots of natural light. It was perfect, and the price was surprisingly affordable. The host, Mark, seemed pleasant enough in his messages, polite, professional, and quick to respond. When I arrived, he met me at the door with a warm smile. He was a tall guy, mid-40s maybe, with neatly combed hair and a button-down shirt that looked just a little too crisp, like he'd ironed it 5 minutes before I showed up. He gave me a quick tour of the apartment. It was just as advertised, a tidy living room, a small but functional kitchen, a cozy bedroom, and a spotless bathroom. But there was one thing that stood out. In the hallway, there was a door marked private. "What's in there?" I asked casually. Mark's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Just a storage room. he said quickly. "Nothing you need to worry about." His tone was light, but there was something in his eyes that didn't sit right with me. Still, I didn't press the issue. I figured everyone's entitled to a little privacy, and I had no intention of snooping. That night, after a long day of meetings, I collapsed into bed. The city sounds outside were muffled by the thick windows, and the mattress was surprisingly comfortable. I drifted off easily, feeling more relaxed than I had in weeks. Then the tapping started. At first, I thought it was just the usual creaks and groans of an old building. But this was different. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the apartment. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound was faint but persistent. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing. But after 10 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and followed the noise. It led me to the private door. Standing there in the dim hallway, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The tapping had stopped. The silence was heavy, pressing against my ears. I leaned closer to the door, pressing my ear against the cool wood. That's when I heard it. A voice. Faint, muffled, and desperate. "Help me," it whispered. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My heart was racing, my palms clammy. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the door, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. I grabbed my phone and called Mark. He answered on the second ring. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice groggy. There's someone in the storage room," I stammered. "I heard them. They said, 'Help me.'" For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then Mark's tone shifted. It was cold now, almost menacing. "There's nothing in that room," he said firmly. "Go back to bed." And then he hung up. I stared at my phone in disbelief. My gut was screaming at me that something was very, very wrong. I couldn't just ignore what I'd heard. Gathering my courage, I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and smashed it against the lock on the private door. It took a few tries, but eventually the lock broke and the door creaked open. The room was small, dark, and completely soundproof. The walls were lined with thick, padded material, and the only furniture was a single metal chair bolted to the floor. A camera on a tripod faced the chair, its lens pointed directly at it. The red recording light was on. I felt my stomach churn as I took in the scene. There were faint stains on the floor beneath the chair, dark, reddish-brown stains that didn't need much imagination to identify. My breath caught in my throat, and I fought the urge to vomit. I didn't stick around to find out more. I grabbed my things, ran out of the apartment, and didn't stop until I was in my car, driving as far away as I could. The next morning, I went straight to the police. They listened to my story with grim expressions, and I could tell this wasn't the first time they'd heard something like this. A few days later, they called to tell me they'd arrested Mark. Apparently, he had a record for, well, let's just say it wasn't good. The case never made the news. I don't know why. Maybe it was too disturbing, or maybe someone wanted to keep it quiet. All I know is that I still have nightmares about that room. Sometimes in the dead of night, I'll wake up to the sound of tapping, and I'll swear I hear that voice again, whispering, "Help me." I haven't stayed in an Airbnb since. Story 3. There's a particular kind of excitement that comes with a solo trip, a blend of freedom and the thrill of being entirely on your own, where every moment feels like an opportunity to reinvent yourself. That was exactly how I felt when I pulled into the driveway of a quaint little Airbnb in a sleepy seaside town. The house stood on a quiet street, framed by a picket fence and the kind of overgrown garden that looked charmingly neglected. It was the perfect escape for someone like me, a writer trying to shake off the cobwebs of a lingering creative slump. The host, Greta, met me at the door, a petite woman with bright eyes and a faint tremor in her hands. "It's been in my family for years," she said as she handed me the keys. "The house has good bones, as they say. Everything here tells a story." Her voice was warm, but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Nervousness? Sadness? Either way, I didn't think much of it. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and wood polish. The furniture was vintage, the kind you'd expect in a place like this. But what immediately caught my attention was the mirror in the hallway. It was enormous, framed in dark wood carved with intricate floral patterns. The glass was slightly warped, the kind that seemed to ripple faintly when you moved. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Greta said, catching me staring. "That mirror is over 100 years old. My great-grandfather brought it back from an estate sale in Europe." "It's gorgeous," I replied, and I meant it. But something about the mirror felt heavy, as if it were more than just a decoration. That first night, I settled into the cozy little guest bedroom, which was just down the hall from the mirror. The house was quiet, eerily so. No hum of traffic, no distant chatter from neighbors. Just the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards as the house settled. As I passed the mirror on my way to the kitchen, I felt it, a chill, faint but undeniable, like walking into an air-conditioned room on a sweltering day. I stopped and glanced at my reflection. It was just me, disheveled hair, tired eyes, nothing out of the ordinary. Drafty old houses, I muttered to myself, shaking off the unease. I was exhausted, so I climbed into bed early, hoping for a good night's sleep. But around 3 a.m., I woke up. At first, I thought it was the house creaking again, but then I heard it, a faint tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from the walls or the windows. It was softer, more deliberate, almost rhythmic. Groggy and annoyed, I got up to investigate. The sound grew louder as I approached the hallway. When I turned the corner, I froze. In the mirror, there was a man standing behind me. He was tall, with pale skin and sunken eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. His suit was old-fashioned, the kind you'd see in black and white photos, and his hair was slicked back as if he'd just stepped out of a funeral parlor. I whipped around, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The hallway behind me was empty. Trembling, I turned back to the mirror. He was still there. This time, his lips curled into a small, almost apologetic smile. He raised a single finger to his lips, the universal gesture for silence. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. Without thinking, I bolted to my room and locked the door. The tapping continued. It was louder now, insistent, like knuckles rapping against glass. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door, willing it to stop. Eventually it did, but sleep didn't come. At dawn, I left my room and cautiously approached the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, tired and hollow-eyed, but thankfully alone. When Greta arrived to check on me, I blurted it out. I described the man, his suit, his face, the tapping. As I spoke, I saw her expression change. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the table. "You saw him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who is he?" I demanded. "Henry," she said after a long pause. "He's been part of that mirror for as long as I can remember. My mother used to say he was cursed. My grandmother said he was a protector. But most people don't notice him. You shouldn't have." She stopped herself, her eyes darting to the mirror. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I packed my things and left that morning, barely pausing to thank Greta for the stay. It's been weeks now, and I still can't shake the memory of his eyes. Every time I pass a mirror, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there, finger pressed to his lips, reminding me to stay silent. The truth is, I don't think I left Henry behind.